Welcome everyone to the Tech Talk on green hydrogen production, onshore versus offshore. Today we'll be covering the following. We'll cover a brief introduction to the topic of green hydrogen, its benefits and its need for it in our society. We will set out the study parameters which we use to develop our analysis to produce the green hydrogen within our onshore and offshore location setting, using offshore wind as a renewable source of electricity. We will then describe the hydrogen process itself, the main building blocks in greater detail. We will then describe how these building blocks were applied to build up 3 different scenarios for hydrogen production. These were based on onshore and offshore production. There will also be a discussion around how these scenarios were developed and analysed to establish which scenario gave us the best economical solution, taking into account the pros and cons of each. And then finally, we'll come to a conclusion, providing our recommendations and possible next steps to further develop the right location for green hydrogen production. So what is meant by green hydrogen? Let's take a step back and think about what is hydrogen itself. Well, it's a very versatile energy carrier. It is used in many applications. It is mainly produced by using fossil fuels, but these fossil fuels do produce CO2 emissions. And in 2020, there was a high demand of hydrogen, approximately 90 million tonnes. So as I said, there's multiple uses. We use it for chemicals such as ammonia production, methanol production. We use it for transportation, so we can use it to produce fuel hydrogen. We can use it to fuel hydrogen trucks or even hydrogen trains. We use it for power generation, so we can actually burn hydrogen to produce energy in gas turbines. So hydrogen has multiple uses. So converting it from normal hydrogen into green hydrogen would be beneficial. But what is this green hydrogen? So green hydrogen itself is water electrolysis by using a renewable source of electricity. This renewable source of electricity can be in the form of wind, such as a wind farm, or solar, such as a solar farm. And because we're using water as the feedstock, we virtually have no carbon within any producing any CO2 emissions. And because we're reducing or eliminating any CO2 emissions, we have a high and significant climate change mitigation potential. So for example, last year, we produced 33,000 million tonnes of CO2. So we can drive that value right down. So the challenges we have, as we have in any new applications, or any new technology, green hydrogen production, is shown here on the right-hand side, such as trade. So how do we actually transport hydrogen in a global market? There's infrastructure issues, such as storage. Typically, we produce hydrogen in a gas form, so do we have to liquefy that? And that costs even more money. Then there's policies such as tax credits. These are usually developed and given out by governments. And then the key one here is the costs. As I said, this is a new area, new technology, so the costs will initially be high. So the key question here is where is the optimal location to produce this green hydrogen using offshore wind as a renewable source of electricity? Is it a green hydrogen onshore or is it green hydrogen offshore? And this is what we'll try to develop in the next few slides. So to develop the analysis for whether or not to produce hydrogen onshore or offshore, we came up with 3 different scenarios shown here. So the first scenario was centralized production onshore. So this is basically producing hydrogen onshore. Centralized production offshore. So this is where we're actually producing hydrogen offshore itself. And then distributed production of hydrogen offshore. So again, producing hydrogen offshore, but on individual wind turbines. And these 3 scenarios will be developed further by my colleague Deirdre in the slides coming up. But to describe the actual basis of our study, I'll go through some key aspects. So here we had the technology. So we took the viewpoint that we wanted to have a system or a process that would be achievable within the next sort of 5 years. So we took the wind farm and the electrolyzer system to be based on a 100 megawatt system. So for a wind farm, 100 megawatts is quite small, relatively small. These are typically gigawatt scale. But for the electrolyzer system, 100 megawatts is relatively large in current day applications. So currently we see electrolyzer systems being 10 to 20 megawatts. So 100 megawatts would be maybe almost like a stretch. So we took them that as a balance. So for the next 5 years, 100 megawatts sort of demonstration phase, you want to call it, would be achievable. So each wind turbine itself would have 10 megawatts each. So therefore we have 10 wind turbines. We also looked at a water depth of 50 meters and also a wind farm located in approximately 30 kilometers from offshore. So again, these are realistic and potentially opportunities for a wind farm to be developed. And then we also took the decision not to take into account any distribution of hydrogen onwards, and no grid connection for any electricity wasn't included. So that sums up the main sort of assumptions for the actual study work that we've done and the three options that we looked at, the three scenarios. And now Deirdre is going to talk you through the main building blocks and how those three scenarios were developed. So I'll pass you over to Deirdre now. Thank you.
Thank you, Luigi. So looking at how green hydrogen is produced, well, the system inputs are water and energy, in this case wind. Using a wind turbine generator, electricity is produced from offshore wind, and this electricity is used to power the electrolyzer, water purification and compression. And in the electrolysis process, water is split into its component parts, hydrogen and oxygen. So the system outputs here are product hydrogen, byproduct oxygen, and briny water, which can be discharged. And the hydrogen is green hydrogen because it's produced with a renewable energy source. We looked at 3 production scenarios. The first was centralized production onshore. In this case, wind energy is converted to electricity offshore. Electricity is relayed onshore, and this is where hydrogen production occurs. Transmission of electricity from offshore to onshore makes use of an offshore substation and high voltage cable infrastructure. In the next scenario, there is production of hydrogen on an offshore platform powered by the wind farm, and subsea pipelines are used to convey hydrogen onshore for further distribution and use. In the last scenario, there is distributed production of hydrogen with electrolyzer modules installed at the turbines. A gathering system is needed and a pipeline to route the combined hydrogen production onshore. In all cases, as said previously, we haven't looked at onshore storage and distribution, and we also haven't looked at an electrical grid connection, which would be possible for the centralized production onshore scenario. Looking at the 3 cases, there are some differences worth noting. In the left-hand case, centralized production onshore, the offshore infrastructure indicated in blue is related to high voltage cabling infrastructure and transmission infrastructure. On the right-hand side, the infrastructure indicated in green is to do with pipeline hydrogen transport. And so in large part, this assessment boils down to the difference in capex and efficiency of power transmission infrastructure versus hydrogen transport infrastructure in the offshore context. In all cases, hydrogen production is a function of wind utilization factor and power losses. Wind utilization will be the same in all 3 cases, but there'll be slight differences in the power losses. And this is apparent in the centralized production onshore case, as we will see later. So how do the results compare? We'll discuss the results in terms of the cases indicated by the different colored bars and the variables that we've assessed. So we have onshore hydrogen production using offshore wind and 2 offshore hydrogen production scenarios also using offshore wind. Looking at capex, there is a marked increase in capex for the onshore centralized production option. And this is due to the electrical transmission infrastructure being the substation and high voltage cabling relative to the cost of pipelines and platforms. The impact, in terms of OPEX is directionally less for the onshore production scenario. And in case of hydrogen production rate due to power losses, the onshore production scenario has a slightly lower hydrogen production rate. In terms of levelized cost of hydrogen, the net impact on levelized cost of hydrogen is that offshore production of hydrogen is more attractive than onshore production, and this is due to the combined impact of the higher capex onshore and the lower hydrogen production rates. Now, how do the system costs compare? When looking at capex, for onshore hydrogen production, the cost of energy supply in the centralized onshore production case is the sum of the blue and the green bars. In this case, energy supply costs dominate the capex costs. Generally speaking, the electrolyzer system costs and wind turbine costs, in other words, power supply costs, are a substantial contributor to capital costs for green hydrogen, and this has implications for where future cost reductions and improvements will need to be sought. And I'll hand you over now to my colleague Luigi.
Thanks, Deirdre. So I'm going to talk you through some of the conclusions and the recommendations that we found. So you can see that from the previous slides that offshore, the two scenarios gave a significantly better economic result than the onshore hydrogen production, with the centralised production offshore being slightly more economical to produce green hydrogen. So the results making the production of offshore scenario more favourable is basically two main points. There's the lower costs of pipeline and compression versus the higher costs of the high voltage cables, and also the availability and to achieve the higher rate of hydrogen production offshore. So those are the two main points you can see here on the right. The positive, offshore uses pipelines and platforms. The negative, onshore uses electrical transmission infrastructure. So those are the two main key points to take away from our study. So these are the recommendations, but what would be the next steps where we can actually maybe develop some more of the work and understanding of the systems. So there's a few here mentioned here. We've got the main ones such as costs. So the electrolyzer unit themselves, they're quite novel, they're quite new, they're still small scale. So we need to develop that into larger scale, and hopefully that will drive down the cost due to repeatability. We have the electrical energy supply itself. Again, as we scale up, we end up bringing the cost down. We have some key drivers such as water depth. So we know that the water depth has an impact on whether you go floating or fixed. So increased water depth would tend to go for floating structures for the wind turbines. We also know that the turbines themselves, we currently look at, say, the 10 megawatt range, but we know we're going to go up to the 50 megawatts in years to come, and perhaps even further. So as the turbines themselves increase in size and energy, then we'll be able to increase utilisation of the actual wind turbine themselves. So we could end up being like higher than 55%. And then we also have the distance from shoreline. So obviously we're looking at further distance from shoreline. Typically we might have the higher water depth, the larger water depth. So we'll go for floating. But there are instances where we can have a large distance from shoreline, but still have a relatively low water depth. And then we have connection issues. So the final end use of a hydrogen. So we've went to all this work to produce the hydrogen itself, whether it's onshore or offshore, but we have to distribute the hydrogen itself. How do we do that when it's onshore? Typically, we find that wherever you produce a hydrogen, you want to ideally use it as close to the actual hydrogen source, because transporting hydrogen and the cost involved in that is typically quite high. And then we looked at the capacity of things, such as connections. So, for example, pipelines. We looked at 100 megawatt systems. So typically the pipelines would be quite small for transporting the hydrogen produced offshore to onshore. Large scales, gigawatt scales, you would have larger pipework infrastructures to transport the hydrogen itself. And then we looked at also the grid connection, the electrical grid connections. if we have let's go grid connections onshore, that might help develop and reduce the costs for the overall electrolyzer system. And the final one here we've noted here is the technology, the maturity of it. Typically these systems are now electrolyzer system themselves are 10, 20 megawatts. We don't know how it's going to be within the next sort of 10 to 20 years. How will they actually operate? What maintenance and performance losses there might be? And maintenance is a key one, perhaps more so for the offshore. Whereas you might have individual electrolyzer units per wind turbine themselves. So a wind farm could be, say, 100 wind turbines themselves. So each wind turbine would have its own electrolyzer units. So that's 100 electrolyzer units to maintain. So how would that actually look like, and how we actually maintain that going forward, and the costs involved. So basically, to sum up, the change in location between the onshore and offshore hydrogen production using a renewable source of offshore wind energy does seem to have a negative impact for the onshore hydrogen production itself. But there are ways of overcoming this via levelized costs based on using a grid connection, which translates into higher utilization and therefore hydrogen production rates. But these will need to be assessed in the days, years ahead, and we'll welcome any more further comments about this in the next sort of slide. Thank you for everybody for your time.